Hi everybody, and welcome to part 2 of making my mermaid bead. This video is pretty much almost all in real time since there's so much detail in it. But first of all, before you actually start putting any elements down, you want to make sure your bead has a really nice heat overall throughout your whole bead and everything's nice and toasty so you don't have cracking issues, later on down the road. And you want to make sure you keep revisiting your bead, especially the back side of the bead, to heat it up and keep everything nice and warm so you have no cracks. So the first thing I'm going to do is add a little barnacle marini to the surface. And so I'm going to heat that a little bit in the back of the flame, heat my spot that I want to put it at in the sand, and then just press it in a little bit. And what I do is I usually place, 2 or 3 or however many I want. I place them first in the same general area, and then I'll melt them down after I have them all placed. So I am going to place 3 of these little barnacle marini on the front, and then I'm going to do another 2 on the back side. So you could actually put these on after you apply your mermaid and after your mermaid is done. But I found that sometimes when you're going to heat that area, you can accidentally heat some of the mermaid hair or the tail or something like that and kind of melt it in and deform it. And so I found that actually putting the barnacles on first could help you out in the long run so that you don't distort any of your surface decoration at the end. And I leave the barnacles, they're raised on the bead, but even if you heat them a little bit as you're going through and making the mermaid, they will reduce down and get closer, more melted into the bead. But that's okay, because they're still like little bumps, they're still raised at the end. And that's not as, important as actually totally melting and distorting the mermaid hair or the tail, etc. So I'm just tapping them very gently. I heat like 1 barnacle at a time, tap it fairly gently down until it's kind of all melded in with the surface and there's no undercuts in the little barnacles. So here's a little close-up of those barnacles on the surface, and I'll turn it a little so you can see how they're raised off the bead there. And now I sped this up a little bit, so this is pretty much probably only the only part that's sped up in this video, but I'm just adding a couple more of those barnacles to the back side. And I'm making sure, as you see there, I'm putting like the rest of the bead in the flame. I'm going back and forth in the flame a little bit, heating the whole bead every once in a while, just moving it through the flame to give it some heat. So getting those barnacles set too. I like to put a little bit of decoration on the back of the bead also. You don't have to, of course. So, and there's the little barnacles on the back. And on the front. So I'm giving it an overall heating again. Not really focusing on those barnacles at all because I want to try not to melt them in, but I'm trying to get the rest of the bead all kind of nice and warm, give it a little bit of heat. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put down the head of the mermaid. And basically, it's just going to be a little dot. And so I figure out where I want to place it. And I stick a little dot on there. And I found actually when I was all done with this bead, I should have actually made her a little bit more to the right of the bead her tail does kind of go around the side a little bit. And so I was kind of disappointed a little bit on that. So her head should have been a little bit more to the right and the whole body would have followed suit. So I'm just putting I'm poking this around, trying to make a little nose stick out. and trying to pull down a little bit for a neck. Just trying to make a general head shape. I'm not really putting a lot of detail in the head because the hair is going to be covering most of her face. And so I really don't need a lot of detail. I'm dotting a little eye there. So there's my little head. Just very general shape. So now I'm taking my ivory and I'm going to actually draw down a little line, very slightly curved, for her body. Adding another little stripe right on top of it. And this is her torso, her top torso. And I'm going to flatten it a little bit to widen it out. And a little more so at the bottom where it starts going into her hips. And there's where I widen it right there. And then I will put a little tiny dot for her little breast. And so the one thing I forgot to actually add to my list of stringers was either a flower cane or any kind of cane or color that you want to use to make like the little seashell coverings on mermaid breasts. I mean, you can leave her bare-breasted, but I got a little red stringer. It's a little encased red stringer that I'm going to use to put like the little, seashell or covering on her breast. So I'm just going to put 2 little swipes, very tiny, on there. And I'll tamp it down a little bit so it's on like the front of her breast there. And then I will just pinch off and pull down so there's a little bit of a taper there at her breast. And so basically her top torso is done. We have no arm yet. We'll put that on later. I want to make sure I keep my bead nice and warm, so I really heat the back. That's one thing about having a plain flat back. And so there's her body and head, or the top of her body and head. And now I'm going to do the tail section. So what I lay down first is I get a larger stringer of glass here, and I think I'm using petroleum green for this. And I'm going to put a large-ish dot there for like her button thigh, the start of her button thigh area. And I'm going to tamp that down and make sure it's melded in with her body and melded in with the base enough, but it's still raised. And I'm going to just smush it down to where I'm happy with the width of it. Because you can always add more glass if you want to bulk it up, but you want the right like kind of footprint for the body. And so now I'm going to go around and add the thigh and go around to the tail. So I start fat with the stringer and then I just go around, make a little circle kind of for the tail. And I add a little more glass to taper down the leg there so it's not a stark contrast between a really fat thigh and then a skinny leg. I want it graduated down the thickness. And then I'm just shaping it a little bit with my dental tool. And I basically have her basic body sections. So I thought I needed a little more butt on this mermaid. So I just added a little bit more glass there and I'm tapping it down towards the back so that it'll stick out a little bit more. And there's the basic body and tail. And so my tail kind of drooped down a little bit far, so I'm just pulling off the end of that tail just so it tapers down to point a little bit better. And now I'm going to use my silver glass, I believe this is Fire Lotus, for the tail section. But first I'm going to use this same color and put little teeny weeny dots all throughout her petroleum green leg section. And of course you don't have to use any silver colors. I could have just used a type of green or a type of blue for her tail and these dots. I just like to use silver glass sometimes to add a little bit of a variety to it. And I wanted to try out this Fire Lotus because this is a new batch of the Fire Lotus they made, and I just wanted to try it out to see how it would work. And I really wanted blues to come out in this, but I basically ended up with purples, so I didn't get the strike I really wanted with her tail, but that's okay. It was basically an experiment. So I'm heating my whole bead, and as you see there, I heat a little bit on the top and the bottom of the mandrel, because the mandrel will get, because of the steel, it'll get cold faster than your actual glass will get cold, and that's where you can really get cracking issues at the edges. So just an FYI there. So now I'm heating a nice big ball of silver glass, and I'm going to make the tail. So I'm going to smush it down right on one side of the bottom of her legs there, and taper out. And then I'm going to flatten that, and then pull it out a little bit more till you get the shape you want. And I'm curving it downward a little bit, almost kind of like a dolphin tail. Keeping my bead warm and heating a little bit of the mandrel on the top and bottom. Just a little flash in the flame, that's all you need. Now I'm going to do the bottom section of the tail. It's the same way. I make a big smush the ball of glass and then pull and taper out. Taper a little bit more till I get the shape I want. And so now I'm going to shape. So I'm going to kind of push these down a little bit, and I'm trying to like heat it like kind of super hot too, so I can get some striking going. But it was hard for me to do this, and I keep trying to go back to it throughout making this bead. So now I just put on either side, I put little cuts just going down the direction of the tail, and these will partially get melted in, but it'll still leave a little variance. And you can always go back and redefine the cuts if you need to. I need to taper that side out again. And then the other side again. And this is going right over to the ivory section. And that side needed a little more glass. But I noticed I had some ivory in there that got stuck in there and made it mucky. So I'm actually pulling that off. So you can correct mistakes that you make, because that section of glass had a little bit of ivory stuck in it, which was turning black in the silver glass, by the way. So I had to pull that off. And now I'm redenting that section, the new section I put on. And you could put as many or as few dents as you want. And I put a little dent in the center between the two fins of the tail. So I'm going to pull that out again. And heat that up. Give an overall heat again to my bead. You don't want this to crack on you. You're spending a lot of time with it. You want to make sure you keep the whole thing warm. Get all the sides, get the back, heat a little bit, flash your mandrel at the top and bottom sometimes. And so I'm trying to get some strike out of this, but I'm really not getting it yet. But I do get a little bit of strike at the end. But like I said, the tail came out purplish instead of, I wanted the blues really. So we're starting to see what looks like, sort of kind of, a mermaid coming out here. And so now I'm going to add her little shoulder and arm section. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to put just a little tiny dot for her shoulder. Very tiny dot. And I'm going to flatten it down a little bit. I turned down my flame there, you see. If you have an issue with over melting your glass or losing control, always turn down your flame if you can. So I have a shoulder there, and now I'm going to pull down her upper arm, pull it straight down to her hip, add a little more glass there, and then I'm going to kind of flatten that down too, so it all becomes one. So her shoulder and arm become one unit. Still trying to strike that tail a little bit. So now I'm going to pull out backwards to create a little bit of an elbow section. And then I do the forearm. I'm going to pull back for that elbow. So I want to meld the forearm and the upper arm into like an L shape, and then add a little, I needed a little more glass there because her arm looked a little thin. Straighten it out, and then I'm going to add a little bit of glass for her hand. And it's really not, I'm not defining fingers or anything, so it's just a ball of glass that I just shape. I try to make it a little more elongated. Instead of a ball shape, I actually try to make it more of an ovalish shape. And then I add a little teeny tiny dot for a thumb. And it's really hard to see in this video, but I try to make a little thumb there with the hand. And so there's basically a bald mermaid. And so I believe now I'm still trying to strike that fire lotus. That's why I turned up my flame there. I was trying to strike it. And I'm basically just getting some yellows now. And I'm redenting the fins, her tail fins. And if I use a straight color, if I used like a straight blue or a purple or a green here, I wouldn't even have to worry about striking it. So that's all up to you. But I'm starting to get a little strike out of it. It's hard to see though. And so now I have a little tiny stringer of silvered ivory. And I like to put moons on my beads, and I make these mermaids. I also make fairies. They're basically the same way as I make the mermaids, but they're fairies with wings, but a side view like this. And I always put a silvered moon on the background of my beads. Kind of one of my signatures. I like to put that in there. And this will be mostly covered up by her hair, but you'll kind of see the moon through it, through her hair. And that's what I'm going to be putting on next. Giving an overall heat to my bead. Heat the front and the top, or the top and the bottom mandrel a little bit. Have it glow a little bit so your steel isn't getting too cold and sucking that heat out of the ends of your beads. And now I'm going to do the hair. So the first part I'm going to do is all around her head. And so I'm going to put the glass where I want to start. And I'm kind of squiggling it around and twisting it and just making a big ball of twisted squiggled glass on the top of her head and going outward from her head a little bit also. And I want to make sure this is all nice and melted in. I'm flattening it down so that it'll cover her head and then go down to the base bead. And after I have that defined, I'm going to trail out some little stringers and wiggle them back and forth, and I'm twisting as I'm laying this down, and I wiggle back and forth and make like her hair flowing off in waves. And so I'm going to put 3 little stripes of hair here coming off her head. And you can make as many or as few as you want. If I had a skinnier stringer, I could have made a lot more hair coming off. So it all depends on what you want. And now I'm going down around the front of her head and then coming down and making a little curly cue that falls down between her head and shoulder there. And then it comes around and makes a little curly cue. And I'm fixing that curly cue. It was a little misshapen. And I'm just pushing it into place so it looks like a nice round curly cue at the bottom there. And I'm melting all that in to make sure it's nice and adhered to the bead. Tapering out the very ends of her hair. And it's kind of the ends are kind of melted into the bead there. At the very tips. And now I'm going to actually put a little bit of texture in her hair. So first I actually swipe up between those stripes of hair I put down, swipe up to the rest of the head, and then I just put little dents and cuts in different directions until you're happy with the way her hair is textured. So you can make it kind of seem like she's got curly Q hair, you can make it seem like she has straight hair, and just put a little bit of dents in it. So heating the bead, trying to strike that tail a little bit more again, way up there in the flame. I'm trying to get it super hot because I wasn't seeing the strike I wanted, so I have to redefine the dents again, trying to get it really super hot there. And then I'm going to strike the hair because some of the strike got lost in the coloring. So I'm restriking the hair now, making sure the bead's nice and warm, getting that hair struck. And then I think I'll get a close-up here. So basically, we now have the completed mermaid. And so now we just have to add a few final touches. And basically, that's just the seaweed on either side. So I take my seaweed stringer, and I kind of like to encapsulate her in the seaweed. So I have one set of seaweed, which are 2 big leaves. I wiggle back and forth as I put these down. So I do one leaf, and then I have the other leaf a little shorter, wiggle back and forth, and have them join at the bottom, come into one plant at the bottom. And then on the other side also, one taller seaweed leaf, and then a second smaller one that actually angles in and meets with the first one. And so now I have my little seaweed. I actually pull them out to a point at the very bottom where they're joined. Tamp that down a little bit. Melt the seaweed in a little. And then I usually put dents in my seaweed. You don't have to put little dents in your seaweed, but it just adds a little more texture to the bead. So I put the little tiny dents in there, focusing on each leaf at a time, one at a time. And I just heat a little bit of it and then put as many cuts as I can put before it cools too much. And so I'm melting it in and putting the little texture on at the same time. Giving some back heat to the bead in the back. Now I'll do the second seaweed. Heat that bead really nicely. Don't want any cracks now, we're almost done. So I'm going to put the little cuts there at the bottom, trying to push it down at the bottom there, it was sticking out. Going up one of the seaweed leaves. And then sometimes there's a little bit of a ball, kind of a sticking out section at the very end, and I try to flatten that out for seaweed. So I'm going down the second one, and I'm trying to be really careful here. I don't want to ruin that little curlicue of hair. I don't want to melt that in too much, so I'm trying to stay away from that. And now basically I'm just giving it a really nice overall heating to the whole bead. I'm turning up my flame a little bit, trying to strike, still trying to strike that tail. And I'm getting a little bit of color there. I don't know if you could see, but I am getting a little bit of the purple, and it did come out fairly purplish at the end. You could see it's coming in now. Making sure the whole bead is getting nice and toasty, especially from the back, because I don't want to melt in the front sections too much. Don't want to distort those. Getting some strike in that tail finally. And there is the final mermaid bead. I hope you enjoyed these videos. Thanks so much for watching.